Hey everyone, my name is Marvin and I like every type of art. Alright, today we're making something that's both super alien and super Egyptian. And look, I know some of you out there are still absolutely convinced that these two things are connected. Maybe you even think the pyramids were built by little green men, which honestly is kinda wild, but hey, I'm more than happy to take the craziness and use it to my advantage, so today we're making Xenomorph Anubis. This time I've already built the space structure so you don't have to sit through that boring part. You're welcome. Now I'm just slipping a thin sheet of clay onto this tangled mass of wire, giving the skeleton its first layer of super sculpey. From here we can start building up the real details. But hey, we're not worrying about details just yet. Right now it's all about bulking up the figure, giving it some mass and saving it from its sad noodle-limbed existence, just roughing out the proportions for now. And then I realized that I absolutely hated the pose. It looked boring, it looked dead. So obviously it had to go. I grabbed my pliers, yanked it off the legs and decided to start over with a fresh wire base from the ground up. This time I went with wolf legs instead of human ones. Because let's be real, Anubis with regular human legs just doesn't look right. Now that I'm happy with the new pose and those wolf-like legs, I can finally start adding more clay and slowly but surely shape this guy into the Anubis he's meant to be. First up, I'm giving him a nice athletic upper body, carefully sculpting his ribs and muscles with my usual mix of sculpting tools. And of course, Anubis needs a ridiculous, good-looking six-pack, because why wouldn't he? Or thought, now that I think about it, a chubby Anubis wouldn't be hilarious. Maybe I save this idea for the next one. Now that Anubis has fully sculpted abs and is looking so ridiculous shredded, he could probably land a starring role as a Baywatch lifeguard. It's time to move on to his tights and calves. These obviously need to match the rest of his physics. So I'm adding a good amount of mass shape to make everything look proportional. Oh, and of course we can't forget about his royal booty. Gotta make sure those glutes are on point to balance everything. Our Anubis doesn't just hit the gym. He trained everything, never skipped leg day. With Anubis' royal booty now in perfect shape, it's time to start refining the details on his tight muscles. I grab my sculpting tools and carefully carve out the definition, making sure everything looks just right. Once that's done, I move on to his back. Because of course Anubis needs a strong, well-defined back to match the rest of his good tier physics. I start adding small pieces of clay, blending them together and shaping everything until I'm happy with how the muscles group look. To finish it off, I take a brush, drown it in isopropyl alcohol and smooth out the surface until everything looks nice and polished. Now it's time to refine the legs even more. I start shaping the lower legs, giving them more definition and continue working on the muscles of the other tights. And now we're finally adding the classic Xenomorph alien things. I honestly have no idea what these are supposed to be, some kind of biomechanical organic skin details? Whatever they are, Anubis is getting them too. I start with his arms, then add larger versions of this real texture surface onto his tights. For this I'm using my small ball stylus tool along with some sharp sculpting tool really carve in those details. Once I'm happy with the organic parts, I move on to texturing Anubis' skin. Using my needle tool, I carefully engrave a scaly alien-like texture into the surface. It actually ends up looking more like the rough reptilian skin of a predator rather than the smooth biomechanical look of a xenomorph. But honestly, hey, I kinda love it. Now it's time to smooth everything out again with some isopropyl alcohol before moving on to the first hand. To make the fingers, I roll out a thin clay noodle and cut it into small sections with my craft knife. Each of the little pieces will become a finger. I attach them to a larger piece of clay which will act as a palm, then carefully blend the connection points. After that I add the thumb, because you know, thumbs are kind of important. Once the hand is ready, I attach it to Anubis' forearm and smooth out the seams using my spoon tool. And then, because you really don't need to watch me do the exact same thing twice, I went ahead and made the second hand off camera. Now it's time for the head. I'm building this in two parts, the lower jaw and the upper jaw. I start by shaping the lower jaw, then attach both pieces together and blend them into a full head. So far so good. Then I attach the head to Anubis' neck, smooth out the seams with my sculpting tools and immediately realize that this is hands down the worst head I have ever made in my interior clay sculpting career. I have no idea what I'm doing at this point. So naturally, I grab my craft knife and just slice off the top layer of the head. Time for a fresh start. I rebuild it with a new piece of clay, tweak the shape a bit, and add 2 small clay balls for the eyes. From there I start refining the eye area, adding small pieces of clay and blend them in until finally it starts looking somewhat decent. Now that the head no longer looks like some cursed fusion of an axolotl and a beaver, I can finally attach the massive ears I sculpted off camera. To do this I use a bit of baking bone to make sure they stay in place, then blend the seams with my sculpting tools, because you know, we're professionals here. I repeat the process for the other ear, then use my fingers to position them just right. After that, I add a long clay noodle that connects the upper jaw to the ears. Remember, this isn't just any regular Anubis, this is Xenomorph Anubis. That means the head needs to have some alien-like features and the ears have to look just right to match the overall creepy aesthetic. Using my sculpting tools I refine the ears even more, shaping them into the final form. I hollow them out a bit by removing some excess clay, then adjust their position with my fingers until they look just right. Now it's time for Anubis armor. With a little bit of magic I transform a simple piece of clay into his wristbands and attach them to his wrist. To make them less boring, I add some extra details using a thinner strip of clay because even ancient alien god need a little flair. Next I rub another long, thin strip of clay around his waist, which will serve as the base for his lower armor, because let's be honest, even in the heat of battle, you gotta protect the gods. For the lower armor I start with a simple rectangular piece of clay and add some extra details to make it more interesting. Technically this is more of a leather loading guard than actual armor, but hey, function over fashion, right? I use a bit of baking bone to attach the leather panel to Anubis' front, then repeat the process off camera for the back. Speaking off camera work, I also went ahead and sculpted his shoulder plates and his classic Egyptian headpiece. With everything ready, I attach all the pieces using more baking bone to make sure they stay in place. Finally it's time for the claws. I pre-baked them in the oven earlier, so now I just attach one to each toe. Next up we're diving into the razor sharp teeth. I've crafted these bad boys from translucent super sculpey and pre-baked them in the oven. Using my trusty tweezers I carefully grab a tooth which has a small clay ball attached with a bit of baking bone. I place it into Anubis' jaw and blend the clay ball with the surface to keep the tooth in place. Now I repeat this process for each and every tooth. Off camera I went ahead and created Anubis' weapon, but don't worry, I later decided on a different one. I've got the whole crafting process on film. Now it's painting time. I start by priming Anubis with his base color using my trusty airbrush. Then I paint him with a darker shade to get the right base color. Unfortunately, my camera battery ran out, so I didn't capture the rest. As you can see, this YouTube channel is all about top-notch expertise. I brightened some areas of the skin by adding highlights, which unfortunately you missed. Now I'm using a purple tone to add more variation to the skin. I apply the purple color to certain parts of the body and blend it with a second brush. I do this on the abs, ribs, head, ears and back, basically all over his body. Now I'm painting the entire armor in gold, starting with the shoulder plates, followed by the headpiece, except for the leather-like loincloth, which I've naturally painted in a brown leather color. Anubis' gums get a flashy pink tone, and his little nose, of course, get painted black. I also paint the claws on his feet black, because that looks the best. The teeth receive a base coat of bone white, and his eyes get a beautiful, glowing wolf yellow. I painted the alien-like biological parts on his arms and legs in black, just like the original Xenomorph aliens. Off camera I crafted a torch from clay, which are now attached to Anubis' hand in 2 parts, making it look like he's holding it. And why a torch, you ask? Why not? Using a fine brush I add vein-like white spots to the torch. These spots will later be the highlights of the fire. Now I use my airbrush and paint the fire on the torch with a neon green tone. Since I previously painted some spots white, those areas now appear much brighter compared to the green only parts. I do the same thing to Anubis' body now. Everywhere the torchlight hits him, I highlight the edges of those areas with white paint. Naturally this includes his fingers and his bracelet, as they cast most of the light. The headpiece also gets some white highlights along with the right side of his face. Now I'm using my airbrush for some OSL, or for you, object source lighting. This means I'm spraying green light in the form of paint wherever the torchlight would fall. This gives the entire figure a wonderfully mysterious appearancy. Now it's time to craft the base. I use some rectangular pieces of XPS foam that I had already cut to size off camera, and I glue them together at the edges with super glue to form a box. Then I craft a lid from clay and modeled it to look like stone floor tiles. I prime the base with my airbrush in a sandstone color. Next I apply a brown wash to let the color flow into all the crevices and cracks. I wipe off the excess paint with a paper towel. Finally I dry brush the whole thing with a lighter color to bring out the details. Off camera I sculpted a skull from clay, but I want more of them. A lot more, since it would take way too long to model each skull by hand. I'm going to make a silicone mold instead. This is 2-part silicone mix that is combined in a 1:1 ratio and hardens after 5 minutes. Now I can fill this mold with clay and quickly create multiple skulls. After using my silicone molds to make a bunch of these skulls and attaching them to my base, I prime them with my airbrush in white. Unfortunately my airbrush battery ran out again, so you won't see how I paint the skulls afterward. Clearly a true professional at work here. With a bit of super glue I now attach Anubis to his base. And here comes the promised new weapon, because I wasn't too keen on the other one. I made a template of an Egyptian sickle weapon out of paper and used it as a guide to cut the weapon from clay with my hobby knife. At roughly a 55-degree angle, I cut the clay to shape the blade. Using a toothpick and some clay wrapped around it, I formed the handle of the weapon. After everything has hardened in the oven, I paint the handle brown, the sickle blade gets a silver coat and a brown wash to give it an aged look. Now I attach the new weapon to Anubis' hand with a bit of super glue. Using a brush dipped in red paint, I add bloody droplets to the skulls by flicking one brush against another. This creates fine blood splatters of the surface. I do the same to Anubis' weapon, adding even more blood with my brush. Now I just need to paint the sides of the base black, and we're done. Time for the final reveal. That's it for this video. We've reached the end once again. A huge thank you to everyone who stuck around until the end. You are the ones who always give me incredible support. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps my video get discovered on YouTube. And don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. I'm signing off. See you next time. Bye.